Imagine a soldier crouching in a frozen trench somewhere on the Eastern Front, thousands of miles from home, surrounded by death on every side. The temperature has plunged to minus 30 degrees Celsius. The man beside him died 2 days ago and nobody has come to retrieve the body. He has not eaten a proper meal in a week. Soviet artillery is pounding his position without pause. He has watched his entire platoon be wiped out over the past month, and replacements keep arriving only to disappear just as quickly. He is exhausted to the point where his hands shake continuously. He cannot sleep, he cannot think straight, and then, in a moment that speaks to the absolute desperation a human being can reach, he raises his rifle, places the barrel against his left hand, and pulls the trigger. What would drive a man, a soldier in the most powerful military force in the world at the time, to deliberately wound himself rather than face another day at the front? In this video, we are going to find out. The story of self-inflicted wounds in the German military during World War II is one of the most sobering and least discussed chapters of the entire conflict. It reveals not just the individual breaking points of men pushed past their limits, but the systemic failures of a regime that treated its own soldiers as expendable resources in an ideological war of annihilation. So without further ado, let's start exploring this dark and deeply human story from the very beginning. To understand why German soldiers began injuring themselves in significant numbers, we first have to understand the world they were thrust into. When the Wehrmacht launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, the invasion of the Soviet Union, it was the single largest military operation in human history. More than 3 million German soldiers, accompanied by Allied troops from Romania, Hungary, Italy and Finland, crossed the Soviet border along a front that stretched nearly 1,800 miles from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. The men who marched east in those early summer weeks were, in many respects, a confident army. They had already conquered Poland in 5 weeks, swept through France and the Low Countries in 6 weeks, and humbled Yugoslavia and Greece with startling ease. They had been told by their officers and by Nazi propaganda that the Soviet Union was a rotten structure that would collapse at the first serious blow. Reich propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels confidently predicted that the campaign would last no more than 8 to 10 weeks. Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, commander-in-chief of the German army, believed his forces would be in Moscow before the autumn rains arrived. Adolf Hitler himself declared that the destruction of the Soviet Union would be child's play compared to what had already been accomplished in the West. These were men who had every reason to believe they were marching toward a quick and total victory. But from the very first days of Operation Barbarossa, the reality began to contradict the propaganda. Yes, the German armies made spectacular advances in those initial weeks, encircling and destroying entire Soviet armies in enormous battles of annihilation at places like Bialystok, Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev. By October 1941, the Wehrmacht had captured over 3 million Soviet prisoners of war, a staggering number that seemed to confirm the early predictions. Yet even as these victories were being celebrated in Berlin, the men on the ground were beginning to sense that something was fundamentally different about this war. The Soviet soldiers they faced did not simply surrender when surrounded, they kept fighting, sometimes to the last man. The distances involved were immense, far greater than anything the German military had previously encountered. Supply lines stretched to the breaking point, and the Soviet Union, rather than collapsing, seemed to absorb every blow and reform, like water closing around a stone. The Russian and Ukrainian countryside was vast and often roadless, turning the rapid advances that had worked so brilliantly in Western Europe into grinding, exhausting slogs through mud and dust. Soldiers began dying not just from enemy bullets, but from the sheer physical demands of marching 20 to 30 miles a day in summer heat, followed by fighting, followed by more marching. The first great crisis came in the autumn and winter of 1941. Operation Typhoon, the German drive toward Moscow, launched in October, initially made good progress. The Wehrmacht encircled entire Soviet army groups at Vyazma and Bryansk, capturing another 650,000 soldiers. It looked briefly as if the capital might fall before winter set in. But then the rains came, turning the Russian roads into rivers of mud in what the Germans came to call the Rasputitsa, the season of mud, when wheeled vehicles sank to their axles and even horses struggled to move. Supplies stopped flowing forward. Exhausted soldiers halted in place. And then, in November, the temperatures plummeted. Not just cold, brutally, impossibly cold by the standards of men who had grown up in Central European climates. The thermometer fell to -20, -30, even -40 degrees Celsius in some areas. The Germans had not been issued adequate winter clothing. Hitler and his high command had been so confident in a quick victory that they had not prepared for winter warfare at all. Soldiers found themselves in summer uniforms, wrapped in whatever newspaper or straw they could find, fighting in temperatures that froze the oil in their weapons so that guns refused to fire. Frostbite cases exploded. Men lost fingers, toes, ears and noses to the cold. The German military recorded an astonishing 133,000 serious frostbite casualties in the winter of 1941 to 1942 alone, more than the total German casualties from all causes during the entire campaign in France and the Low Countries the year before. It was in this context of unimaginable suffering that the phenomenon of Selbstverstümmelung began to emerge in significant numbers within the German military. The word itself translates literally from German as self-mutilation, and it referred to the deliberate self-infliction of wounds by soldiers in order to escape frontline service. The practice was not entirely new to warfare. Soldiers in every conflict throughout history have occasionally resorted to such desperate measures. But in the German military during World War II, it reached a scale and a systematic quality that made it a recognized problem at every level of command, from company commanders up to the highest levels of the Wehrmacht leadership. The German military legal code treated self-inflicted wounds with extreme severity. Under paragraphs 141 and 142 of the Militärstrafgesetzbuch, the Military Penal Code, deliberate self-mutilation to avoid military service was classified as a serious crime carrying penalties ranging from years of imprisonment in a military penitentiary to the death sentence in cases deemed particularly serious, or in cases where the act was committed in the face of the enemy. The message from the High Command was unambiguous. A soldier who wounded himself to escape his duty was a coward and a traitor, and he would be treated accordingly. But why did soldiers do it anyway, knowing the severe penalties that awaited them if they were caught? The answer to this question requires understanding what daily life on the Eastern Front was actually like for ordinary German soldiers. Letters and diaries that survived the war paint an extraordinarily grim picture. A soldier in the 6th Infantry Division wrote home to his family in November 1941 that he had not changed his clothes in 6 weeks, that the men in his unit were sleeping in cramped, lice-infested bunkers dug into frozen ground, that they were surviving on reduced rations of bread and canned horse meat, and that the constant Soviet artillery fire had given him headaches that never completely went away. Another soldier, serving with a panzer division on the road to Moscow, wrote that he had watched 17 of the 40 men in his platoon die or be wounded in a single week. He wrote that he no longer felt anything when he saw a dead comrade. The feeling had been worn away, like paint from a wall, by too many exposures to loss. These were not unusual testimonies, they were typical. Historians who have studied the wartime correspondence of German soldiers, most comprehensively the German historian Professor Klaus Latzel, in his analysis of thousands of frontline letters, have documented the progression in tone from the confident, even enthusiastic letters of 1939 and 1940 to the despairing, sometimes incoherent letters of 1941 and 1942. Something was breaking inside the Wehrmacht, not all at once and not in every man, but steadily, like metal fatigue in a bridge bearing too great a load. The conditions that drove men to self-inflict wounds were multiple and cumulative. Sleep deprivation was one of the most underappreciated factors. Soldiers on the Eastern Front routinely went for days at a time with only a few hours of broken sleep, never knowing when the next Soviet attack or bombardment would come. The continuous alert state meant that the human nervous system never had the chance to properly recover between stresses. Medical science today recognizes what it could only partially understand in the 1940s, that chronic sleep deprivation progressively degrades cognitive function, emotional regulation, and impulse control, making extreme decisions more likely and more easily rationalized. Men who had been responsible, thoughtful citizens in peacetime found themselves making choices they could never have imagined making before the war. The combination of exhaustion, hunger, cold, grief, fear, and the ever-present knowledge that any moment might be the last one had a cumulative, corrosive effect on the human psyche that no amount of ideological indoctrination or unit pride could entirely counteract. There was also the matter of what soldiers were witnessing. The war on the Eastern Front was not simply a military campaign. From the very beginning, it was carried out as a war of racial annihilation, following directives from Hitler and the Nazi High Command that specifically ordered the murder of Soviet political commissars, the deliberate starvation of Soviet prisoners of war, and the massacre of Jewish communities in occupied territories. The Einsatzgruppen, SS mobile killing units, followed directly behind the advancing German armies, shooting hundreds of thousands of Jews, Soviet officials, and anyone else deemed an enemy of the Third Reich. Many German soldiers witnessed these killings directly. Some participated in them either willingly or under orders. The psychological effect of this exposure to mass murder, of having killed civilians, of having watched neighbours and fellow soldiers kill civilians, was devastating for men who had not entirely shed their moral consciences. While the Nazi regime worked to present these killings as necessary and even righteous acts of racial warfare, a significant proportion of German soldiers experienced profound psychological disturbance as a result. What we today would recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, known during the war by the German military as Kriegsneurose, or war neurosis, manifested in countless soldiers and the psychiatric wards of Wehrmacht hospitals filled with men who could no longer function. The question of Selbstverstümmelung was therefore not really a simple story of cowardice, as the Nazi regime and military leadership preferred to characterize it. It was far more complex, a story about human beings pushed past the limits of endurance by conditions that were themselves the product of monstrous decisions made in Berlin. And yet, the men who resorted to self-injury faced precisely that charge of cowardice, along with the very real possibility of execution if they were discovered. What exactly did these acts of self-injury look like, and how widespread were they? The most common method of self-inflicted wounding among German soldiers on the Eastern Front was a gunshot wound to the left hand, or, less frequently, the left foot. The rationale for targeting the left hand was straightforward. Right-handed soldiers would preserve their dominant hand, and wounds to the left hand, while painful and potentially disfiguring, were unlikely to be fatal. A gunshot wound that shattered the bones of the left palm or took off a finger or two would typically be serious enough to require evacuation from the front to a military hospital in the rear, followed by weeks or months of recovery, potentially in Germany itself. This was the prize that made the risk worthwhile in the minds of desperate men: getting out, getting away from the trenches, from the artillery, from the cold, from the constant attrition of unit after unit ground down to nothing, even temporary escape, even the prospect of being in a warm hospital bed with regular food and no incoming fire, was worth almost any cost to men who had been living for months in conditions of extreme hardship. But shooting oneself in the hand presented a significant tactical challenge: how to explain the wound to military doctors and investigators who were specifically trained to identify self-inflicted injuries. The German medical corps developed increasingly sophisticated methods for detecting what they called Eigenschädigungen, self-inflicted injuries. The most important diagnostic tool was gunshot residue analysis. When a firearm is discharged at close range, it leaves characteristic powder burns and residue on the skin and clothing surrounding the entry wound. A wound inflicted by an enemy bullet from a distance of more than a few meters would show no such residue, while a self-inflicted wound would typically show heavy powder burns on the skin around the entry point and on the fingers and palm of the hand that held or positioned the barrel. Military doctors were instructed to examine every suspicious hand or foot wound carefully for these residue patterns. Soldiers who wanted to avoid detection quickly developed countermeasures. One widely used technique was to fire the shot through a thick piece of bread, a cloth, or a piece of wood, placed between the muzzle and the hand, which would absorb much of the powder residue while still allowing the bullet to pass through and inflict a wound. Another method was to arrange for a comrade to fire the shot, positioning the weapon at a distance sufficient to eliminate close-range powder burns while still inflicting a wound that looked like it could have been received in combat. This was an arrangement fraught with risk for both parties, since the comrade could himself face charges if the scheme was discovered, but it was used nonetheless. Some soldiers went even further, deliberately placing themselves in exposed positions during actual firefights in the hope that an enemy bullet would wound them without killing them, allowing the injury to be completely genuine while serving the same purpose of evacuation from the front. This last method was particularly difficult to trace and presumably went undetected in many cases. Frostbite presented another avenue for escape that blurred the line between the deliberate and the accidental. The German military recognized from early in the Eastern Front campaign that some soldiers were deliberately exposing themselves to frostbite conditions in order to sustain injuries serious enough to warrant evacuation. Men would remove their boots and gloves in extreme cold, sometimes sitting motionless in frozen positions for periods long enough to cause significant tissue damage. The resulting frostbite, especially if it reached the level of third-degree injuries where tissue actually begins to die, could be severe enough to require amputation of toes or fingers, permanently removing the soldier from front-line duty. Distinguishing deliberate from accidental frostbite was extraordinarily difficult, since the conditions of the Eastern Front in winter were so severe that genuine frostbite occurred constantly. Some military doctors suspected certain cases were deliberate and noted their suspicions in medical records, but without conclusive proof, many such cases were treated as legitimate combat injuries. The German military leadership was acutely aware of the problem from a very early stage. As early as September 1941, even before the worst of the winter crisis had fully developed, Wehrmacht High Command issued orders specifically addressing Selbstverstümmelung and directing divisional commanders to ensure that all cases were investigated and prosecuted. The orders noted with alarm that reports of self-inflicted wounds were coming in from multiple sectors of the front simultaneously, suggesting the problem was widespread rather than isolated. By December 1941, as the German forces before Moscow struggled through temperatures that fell below -40 degrees in some places, the rate of suspected self-inflicted wounds was high enough that it was receiving attention at Army Group level. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, commanding Army Group Center during this critical period, issued specific orders demanding that Feldgericht, the military field courts, take all cases seriously and impose exemplary sentences. The message was clear. The leadership was frightened by what it was seeing, even if it was not prepared to acknowledge in public that its soldiers were choosing self-destruction over continued service. The Feldgericht system was the military judicial apparatus that handled these cases, along with all other military crimes committed by German soldiers. Each army division had its own Feldgericht, staffed by military judges, prosecutors, and defense attorneys, operating under the Militärstrafgesetzbuch and the separate wartime emergency penal provisions that had been introduced in 1939. The courts had broad powers, including the authority to impose the death penalty for a wide range of offences, and they were not noted for leniency. The German military justice system executed approximately 15,000 of its own soldiers during the course of the Second World War, a number roughly 50 times higher than the comparable figure for British and American military justice combined. The difference was in large part a reflection of the ideology of the state. The Nazi regime believed in extreme violence as a tool of social control, and it applied that philosophy to its own armed forces as readily as it applied it to the occupied peoples of Europe. For a soldier convicted of Selbstverstümmelung, the potential consequences ranged enormously depending on the circumstances and the attitude of the particular Feldgericht that tried the case. A soldier who could demonstrate that his wound was the result of careless handling of his own weapon, or who could produce a plausible combat scenario that might have resulted in the injury, might escape with a severe reprimand and return to frontline duty, or with a sentence of several months in a military prison. But a soldier who was conclusively demonstrated to have deliberately shot himself, especially if he had induced a comrade to help, or if the wound occurred in circumstances where the prosecution could argue it was committed in the face of the enemy, faced the death penalty. Execution was carried out by firing squad, and in the later years of the war the sentences could be carried out with brutal speed, sometimes within hours of sentencing. The body would typically be displayed at the front for a period to serve as a warning to other soldiers. Yet despite these terrifying consequences, the practice continued and indeed grew as the war progressed and conditions deteriorated further. This fact alone tells us something profound about the psychological state of German soldiers on the Eastern Front. When men are willing to risk execution in order to escape a situation, it means that they have genuinely come to regard the situation as worse than death. That is the true measure of what the Eastern Front was doing to the human beings it consumed. Some soldiers, perhaps many, reached the point where the fear of the Soviet artillery, the cold, the starvation, the exhaustion, and the relentless death of everyone around them outweighed even the fear of being caught, court-martialed, and shot. This represents a complete inversion of the fear hierarchy that military discipline depends upon. The soldiers had come to fear the front more than they feared their own command. The scale of the phenomenon, insofar as it can be determined from surviving records, is difficult to establish with precision. German military records from the Second World War are incomplete, partly because of the deliberate destruction of records in the final weeks of the conflict, and partly because the chaos of defeat resulted in the loss of enormous quantities of documentation. What has survived in German archives suggests that the Wehrmacht's Feldgericht system tried many thousands of cases of suspected Selbstverstümmelung over the course of the war. One analysis of surviving court records conducted by German military historian Manfred Messerschmitt in his comprehensive study of Wehrmacht justice published in the 1990s suggested that self-inflicted wound cases represented one of the more common categories of serious military crimes prosecuted by the German field courts, trailing only desertion and Wehrkraftzersetzung, the undermining of military morale, in frequency. But these numbers represent only the cases that were detected, investigated, and brought to trial. The true number of self-inflicted wounds, including those that successfully passed as combat injuries, is impossible to determine with any confidence. Military historians generally believe the actual number was significantly higher than the formal prosecution statistics suggest, perhaps several times higher. What kinds of men were most likely to resort to self-injury? The available evidence suggests that there was no single demographic profile. Self-inflicted wounds were found among soldiers of all ranks, though they were naturally more common among the lower enlisted ranks, who bore the greatest burden of frontline combat and had the least ability to escape it through legitimate means such as staff positions or rear area postings. Officers could generally arrange safer assignments for themselves more easily than enlisted men, and also faced a somewhat different psychological dynamic. The shame associated with self-injury would have been more acute for men who held positions of authority and who were expected to set an example for their subordinates. But even among officers, cases were not unknown. Age was another factor. Older soldiers, men in their 30s and 40s who had been called up in the later mobilization waves of the war, often found the physical demands of frontline service more difficult to sustain than their younger comrades, and they were more likely to have established civilian lives, wives, children, careers, that gave them concrete things to want to survive for and return to. Many of the cases that appear in surviving military court records involve men who had received letters from home about dying relatives or struggling families, men who were desperate to return to their civilian lives but had no legitimate means of doing so. The German military's leave and rotation system was extremely inadequate by the standards of most other armies in the conflict. German soldiers on the Eastern Front might serve for a year or more without any home leave at all, a situation that had no equivalent in the British or American armies where regular rotation and leave were considered essential for maintaining fighting effectiveness. This isolation from home and family was itself a significant psychological stressor that contributed to the conditions in which self-injury became thinkable. The geography of the Eastern Front also shaped the phenomenon in important ways. Self-inflicted wound cases were notably more common in certain sectors and certain periods than others, and these variations tell us something about the relationship between tactical conditions and psychological breakdown. The winter of 1941 to 1942 produced an early spike in cases that corresponded directly with the physical crisis of the German forces before Moscow. The summer of 1942, which saw the German southern advance towards Stalingrad and the Caucasus, was a period of somewhat lower reported cases. The armies were advancing, supply conditions were somewhat better, and the sense that victory was still possible had not entirely evaporated. But the catastrophe at Stalingrad, where the entire German Sixth Army was encircled and eventually destroyed between November 1942 and February 1943 with the loss of over 300,000 men killed, captured or missing, triggered the most dramatic escalation in Selbstverstümmelung cases recorded during the entire war. The Stalingrad disaster was a psychological turning point, not just for the German public, but for every soldier serving on the Eastern Front. Until Stalingrad, it had been possible to believe, despite the setbacks of 1941 and 1942, that Germany still had a path to victory, that the massive effort and sacrifice were being directed toward a realistic goal. After Stalingrad, this belief became increasingly difficult to sustain. The destruction of an entire army, including 24 generals, 90,000 surviving soldiers marched into Soviet captivity, from which most would never return, and a field marshal who had surrendered rather than fight to the death as Hitler had demanded, shattered the image of Wehrmacht invincibility. For soldiers who had been watching their comrades die one after another for months, Stalingrad confirmed what some had begun to suspect. They were not winning this war, and the leadership that was demanding their lives and sanity did not have a plan that would lead to victory. The realization that one might be dying for nothing, that the suffering had no redemptive purpose, no endpoint that justified the cost, is one of the most psychologically destructive thoughts a soldier can have. And after Stalingrad, that thought was available to every German soldier who chose to entertain it. The escalation in self-inflicted wound cases after Stalingrad was significant enough that Wehrmacht High Command responded with a series of increasingly harsh directives. In February 1943, immediately following the final German surrender at Stalingrad, the Oberkommando der Heer, the German Army High Command, issued a directive specifically addressing the problem of soldiers deliberately injuring themselves to avoid combat. The directive noted that cases of this type had increased sharply and ordered that all such cases be treated with the utmost severity. Divisional commanders were personally held responsible for ensuring that their Feldgericht properly investigated every suspicious wound, and that convictions were followed by meaningful punishment. The use of the death penalty in such cases was explicitly encouraged, and the directive noted that sentences should be communicated to all soldiers within the relevant unit as a deterrent. The man behind much of this harsh policy was the head of the Wehrmacht's legal system, Reichsminister der Justiz, and later also the head of the OKW Rechtsabteilung. But more immediately, the driving force was the fanatical Nazi judge Erich Schwinger, and men like him who believed that brutal discipline was the only answer to what they saw as a collapse of fighting spirit. Schwinger authored the authoritative wartime commentary on the military penal code and consistently advocated for maximum sentences across all categories of military crime. His influence on the culture of the Feldgericht system was profound, and it pushed the courts toward ever harsher outcomes precisely at the moment when the military situation was most desperate and soldiers were most likely to break. There was a grim irony at the heart of this escalating harshness. The very measures intended to deter self-injury often made the underlying conditions worse. Public executions of convicted soldiers, carried out in front of assembled units, did not necessarily inspire resolution and courage in the surviving witnesses. For men already at the edge of psychological collapse, the spectacle of a comrade being shot for trying to escape could be as likely to produce paralysis and despair as steely determination. Some survivors of these punitive spectacles later testified that witnessing them had deepened their sense of hopelessness rather than reinforcing their will to fight. The logic of terror that the Nazi system applied to its own soldiers operated on the assumption that human beings could be made to endure anything through sufficiently severe threats. What it did not account for was the point beyond which threats lose their effectiveness because the threatened reality, life at the front, has already become indistinguishable from the threatened punishment. Let us now turn to the specific experience of soldiers in the first great winter crisis of the war, the winter of 1941 to 1942, to understand in human terms what conditions actually looked like for the men who first began resorting to self-injury in significant numbers. The German soldier who found himself in the line before Moscow in December 1941 was typically a man who had been in continuous combat for nearly 6 months. He had marched hundreds of miles across the Soviet Union. He had seen the summer turn to autumn, and the autumn to the most brutal winter in European memory. Meteorological records suggest that the winter of 1941 to 1942 was indeed one of the coldest of the 20th century in that region, with temperatures in some areas reaching -50 degrees Celsius, cold enough to freeze water inside a sealed container within minutes. His uniform, designed for the mild European climates he had campaigned in previously, was completely inadequate. His boots were often soaked and frozen stiff. His weapons had to be heated with precious fuel before they would function. His rations had been cut to minimum sustenance levels because the supply lines stretching back through the Soviet Union were themselves frozen, bombed, or simply overwhelmed. And he had received no coherent information about when or whether he would be relieved, rotated, or allowed to rest. The German army's handling of the winter clothing problem in 1941 has been extensively analysed by historians and military strategists as one of the most extraordinary failures of military logistics in modern warfare. Hitler had explicitly forbidden the pre-deployment of winter clothing and equipment for the Eastern Front campaign on the grounds that to do so would signal that the campaign was expected to last longer than the summer. He believed that acknowledging the need for winter preparations would undermine the confidence of his commanders and, through them, of the troops. The result was that when winter arrived with full force, the Wehrmacht was caught, almost completely unprepared. Emergency measures were taken. Civilian collections of winter clothing were organised in Germany, with propaganda posters urging citizens to donate furs and heavy clothing for the soldiers. But these improvised solutions were wholly inadequate for the scale of the problem and arrived too late and in too small quantities to make a meaningful difference. The official German medical records for the winter of 1941 to 1942 record over 133,000 cases of severe frostbite, but these numbers almost certainly undercount the true total, since many cases were treated at unit level by medics who did not file formal reports, and many more men suffered frostbite without it being recognised as such. Against this backdrop, the temptation to deliberately sustain frostbite serious enough to warrant evacuation must have been intense for many soldiers. And here lay a particularly difficult moral and legal problem for the German military authorities. Distinguishing deliberate from accidental frostbite was essentially impossible in most cases. The environmental conditions were so extreme that any failure to take adequate protective measures could quickly result in frostbite, and there was often genuine ambiguity about whether a particular case resulted from combat necessity, having to remain immobile and exposed during a firefight, for instance, or from deliberate self-neglect. Some military doctors developed suspicions about soldiers who presented with suspiciously localized frostbite, especially when the affected areas were the toes of both feet, which might suggest the deliberate removal of footwear in cold conditions rather than the more irregular patterns expected from accidental cold injury. But suspicion was not evidence, and the chaotic conditions of the winter of 1941 to 1942 made formal investigations extremely difficult. Many cases that might have been deliberately induced were treated as genuine combat injuries simply because there was no practical way to prove otherwise. The relationship between the German military medical system and the problem of self-inflicted wounds was one of the most ethically fraught aspects of the entire phenomenon. The sanitator, the German military medics and doctors who staffed the battalion aid stations, field hospitals, and rear area military hospitals, occupied a uniquely difficult position. On one hand, they were trained as healers, bound by the traditions of medical ethics to treat the sick and wounded without discrimination. On the other hand, they were uniformed soldiers serving within a military system that demanded they report any suspected Selbstverstümmelung to military authorities, effectively functioning as agents of military justice as well as medicine. This dual role created profound tensions that individual doctors resolved in very different ways. Some military doctors took their reporting obligations extremely seriously and became, in effect, aggressive investigators of suspected, self-inflicted wounds. These men would examine every suspicious injury with great care, document gunshot residue, note the angle and nature of the wound track, consult with colleagues, and produce detailed medical reports that formed the basis of prosecutions before the Feldgericht. Their motivations varied. Some were genuine ideological Nazis who viewed Selbstverstümmelung as a form of treason and felt a patriotic duty to expose it. Others were simply career military men who feared the consequences of being seen as lax in a system that demanded absolute conformity to its harsh norms. And some may genuinely have believed that strict enforcement was necessary to maintain military effectiveness at a moment of national crisis. Whatever their motivations, these doctors played a crucial role in identifying and prosecuting cases that might otherwise have gone undetected. But other military doctors took a very different approach. There is substantial evidence, drawn from post-war testimonies, memoirs, and surviving medical records, that a significant number of Wehrmacht doctors quietly facilitated the escape of soldiers they recognized as being at the breaking point. These doctors might diagnose a self-inflicted wound as a legitimate combat injury, choosing not to look too closely at the evidence that might point toward deliberate action. They might document a case of extreme psychological disturbance, what was then called Kriegsneurose, in terms designed to maximize the likelihood of the patient being removed from frontline duty without facing criminal prosecution. Some doctors took even more direct action, fabricating diagnoses or falsifying medical records to ensure that men they believed could not continue fighting were removed from danger through medical channels rather than legal ones. These acts of quiet medical resistance represented a different form of moral courage from the military heroism celebrated by the Nazi propaganda machine, but they were no less real for that. One of the most striking documented cases of medical complicity in what amounted to a kind of unofficial system of escape involves the use of what soldiers called Halsschuss, a wound to the throat or neck region that was serious enough to require immediate evacuation, but not so serious as to be typically fatal. While not a self-inflicted wound in the most common sense, the deliberate seeking out of grazing wounds or minor injuries in exposed areas was sometimes facilitated by medical personnel who had sympathy for the psychological state of the soldiers in their care. The records of certain field hospitals from the Eastern Front show patterns that later military historians found suspicious. Clusters of similar types of wounds, concentrations of men from specific units who were known to be at breaking point, treated by specific doctors who later came under scrutiny for their wartime conduct. In most cases, nothing was formally proven, and the doctors in question continued their careers after the war without prosecution. But the patterns suggest a quiet, unspoken network of compassion operating beneath the surface of the formal military system's brutal logic. The question of what was happening psychologically to German soldiers also brings us to the larger issue of what the German military called Kriegsneurose, war neurosis, and what we would today recognize as combat-related post-traumatic stress disorder. The existence of psychological breakdown under extreme combat conditions had been recognized since the First World War, where it had been called shell shock, a term that reflected the initially widespread belief that the condition was caused by the physical trauma of nearby explosions rather than by the psychological experience of warfare. By the Second World War, psychiatry had advanced sufficiently to recognize that the condition was primarily psychological in origin, though the physical trauma of combat certainly contributed to it. The German military had a dedicated psychiatric corps, and each army had psychiatrists attached to rear area hospitals who were supposed to treat and return to duty soldiers suffering from combat neurosis. The German military psychiatric approach to Kriegsneurose was significantly influenced by the ideological imperatives of the Nazi regime. The official position, reflecting Nazi beliefs about racial strength and willpower, was that genuine psychiatric breakdown from combat was a sign of individual weakness and, implicitly, of racial inferiority. A true German soldier, shaped by the hard experiences of the Hitler Youth and the military training system, was supposed to be capable of enduring whatever the battlefield demanded. Soldiers who broke down psychologically were therefore viewed with deep suspicion, often as malingerers seeking to escape duty behind a medical diagnosis, rather than as genuinely ill patients. This attitude shaped the treatment protocols used in Wehrmacht psychiatric units, which emphasized rapid return to combat duty, rather than genuine recovery. Psychiatric facilities were deliberately kept austere and unpleasant, on the theory that making psychiatric treatment too comfortable would incentivize soldiers to simulate neurosis. The message was clear. Being mentally ill was almost as shameful as being a coward, and soldiers who sought help for psychological problems could expect to be treated harshly rather than compassionately. This attitude had two important effects on the phenomenon of self-inflicted wounds. First, it meant that the psychological needs of soldiers in genuine distress were systematically unmet, allowing deterioration to the point where physical self-injury seemed like a rational solution. If the military had provided genuine psychological support and relief for men at the breaking point, some proportion of those who later resorted to self-injury might have found legitimate pathways to recovery and return to duty, or at least to non-combat roles where they would not have been a danger to themselves or their units. Instead, the rejection of psychological distress as legitimate created a system where soldiers had essentially two choices: continue fighting until they were killed, or find a way out that involved physical injury. Second, the stigma attached to psychological breakdown meant that many soldiers who were genuinely suffering from what we would now call PTSD disguised their symptoms, or transformed their psychological pain into physical symptoms, a process that psychiatry today recognizes as somatization. Some cases of self-inflicted physical wounds may have been, at some level, the outward manifestation of psychological pain that had no other recognized outlet. The role of ideology in both motivating and maintaining soldiers also deserves careful examination. The German soldier of the Second World War was surrounded by ideological messaging from the moment he entered military service. The Wehrmacht's training system incorporated substantial elements of National Socialist ideology alongside traditional military discipline. Officers were expected to be political soldiers, ideological leaders as well as tactical commanders, and the influence of the Nazi Party's military formations, particularly the SS, which operated its own military units alongside the regular army, created a constant pressure toward ideological conformity. Soldiers who expressed doubts about the war, about its conduct, or about the regime that had launched it could face charges of Wehrkraftzersetzung, the undermining of military morale, which carried penalties as severe as those for self-inflicted wounds. The legal category of Wehrkraftzersetzung was extraordinarily broad. It could encompass anything from expressing pessimism about the outcome of the war to making a defeatist joke, from refusing a direct order to publicly questioning the wisdom of the high command. Over 15,000 soldiers were executed under this charge during the war, many of them for nothing more than expressing despair in a letter home or to a comrade. The effect of this ideological pressure on the decision to self-inflict wounds was paradoxical. On one hand, it reinforced the shame associated with any act of cowardice or desertion, potentially deterring some soldiers from taking that step. On the other hand, it created a system of total surveillance and total demand that left individual soldiers with essentially no legitimate private space, no recognized right to acknowledge their own limits, and no mechanism for communicating distress without risking punishment. In such a system, secret, unacknowledged self-injury could come to seem like the only available form of agency, the only way to exercise some control over one's own fate in an apparatus that had otherwise claimed total ownership of one's life and body. How did German soldiers actually speak about Selbstverstümmelung among themselves? This is difficult to recover from the historical record because letters and diaries that touched on such sensitive topics were routinely censored by the Wehrmacht's Postal Inspection Service, the Feldpostzensur, which read a sample of all letters from the front and could confiscate those deemed harmful to morale or revealing of sensitive information. Many soldiers therefore wrote in guarded, coded language about subjects that might attract official attention. But enough has survived in uncensored letters that evaded inspection, in post-war memoirs, in the testimonies of veterans interviewed by historians decades after the war, to give us some sense of how the phenomenon was perceived at ground level. The picture that emerges from these sources is complex. Some soldiers viewed Selbstverstümmelung with genuine contempt, internalizing the official line that it represented a betrayal of comrades and country. These men had typically built their sense of identity and self-worth around their role as soldiers and around the bonds of unit loyalty and comradeship that were among the most powerful psychological forces operating on the front. To them, a man who shot himself in the hand was not just a coward, but a traitor to the men he served beside, a man who was adding his share of the burden to the backs of those who remained. There are accounts in post-war testimonies of soldiers who, upon discovering that a comrade had self-inflicted a wound, refused to cover for him, instead, reporting him to officers, not out of any love for the authorities, but out of a genuine sense that the man had violated the unspoken contract of shared suffering that bound frontline soldiers together. But other soldiers took a very different view. Many testimonies reveal a quiet, pragmatic sympathy for men who had reached their limits, a recognition that anyone might eventually arrive at the same point, that the conditions of the Eastern Front were inhuman, and that the human response to inhumane conditions could not always be policed by ideology. Veterans who spoke about such cases in post-war interviews often described them with a mixture of understanding and sadness, rather than with condemnation. Some recalled helping comrades to disguise or explain away suspicious wounds, providing false accounts of the circumstances in which the injury occurred, or using their authority as NCOs or officers to suppress inquiries that might have led to an investigation. These acts of unofficial solidarity, men protecting each other from the legal machinery of a system that demanded their annihilation, represented a form of human decency operating within the brutal framework of the Eastern Front. small gestures of compassion in an environment systematically designed to eliminate compassion. The seasonal rhythm of the Eastern Front also shaped when and where self-inflicted wounds were most common. As noted earlier, the first major crisis occurred in the winter of 1941 to 1942, but subsequent winters produced their own spikes. The pattern became familiar to Wehrmacht commanders as the temperatures plunged in late autumn, as the supply situation deteriorated and the possibility of winter quarters in reasonably safe positions receded. The rate of suspicious wounds rose. Summer advances, which at least offered the compensations of movement and occasional success, typically saw lower rates. Static defensive positions in winter, where soldiers sat in frozen holes in the ground with no tactical purpose beyond surviving the next artillery bombardment, were the circumstances most likely to produce desperate men. The Festungen, the fortified positions that Hitler increasingly ordered to be held at all costs, as the war turned against Germany in 1943 and 1944, created environments of extreme psychological stress precisely because their defenders knew they were being ordered to die in place rather than to accomplish anything constructive. Reports from these positions consistently mention high rates of self-inflicted wounds, combat fatigue cases, and desertion. There was also a significant element of social learning involved in the spread of Selbstverstümmelung. Soldiers are profoundly influenced by the behavior of those around them, and the knowledge that a comrade had successfully escaped the front through self-injury, that the wound had been accepted as genuine, that the man was now in a hospital somewhere warm and safe, perhaps even on his way back to Germany, could be enormously suggestive to other men in desperate circumstances. The methods used spread through informal networks of communication within units, just as any practical knowledge spreads through social groups. How to minimize powder burns, which areas of the body offered the best combination of serious wounding and low lethality. How to construct a story about the circumstances of injury that would satisfy military doctors. These were pieces of knowledge that circulated through the frontline world, spoken in hushed conversations in bunkers and trenches, passed from veteran to new arrival as part of the informal education that every frontline soldier received from those who had been there longer. The German military authorities were aware of this social transmission of knowledge and attempted to counter it through a combination of increased surveillance, more rigorous medical investigation protocols, and propaganda campaigns within the military aimed at shaming soldiers who might be contemplating self-injury. Special posters and pamphlets were distributed to frontline units depicting self-inflicted wounds as shameful and cowardly, and contrasting such acts with the heroism of the fallen. Commanders were instructed to discuss the issue directly with their men, emphasizing both the moral dimension and the practical reality that detection and prosecution were near certain outcomes for anyone who attempted it. These campaigns had some effect, but they could not eliminate a behavior that was driven by conditions too extreme to be managed through exhortation. Let us now examine in detail some of the documented cases that give us a more concrete picture of the individuals behind the statistics. The records of the Wehrmacht's Feldgericht system, though incomplete, include a number of cases that have been studied by historians and that illuminate the human reality behind the official category of Selbstverstümmelung. One of the most extensively documented types of cases involves soldiers who induced a comrade to shoot them, typically framing the request in terms of a tragic accident. A typical scenario, reconstructed from court records, might run as follows. Private Heinz K., serving with a Wehrmacht infantry unit on the Eastern Front in the winter of 1942, approaches his closest friend in the unit, a man from the same town who has been his comrade since basic training. He explains that he cannot continue. He has not slept properly in 2 weeks. His fingers are black with frostbite. He has watched every man he entered Russia with either die or be evacuated with wounds, and he himself has been wounded once, returned to duty, and now faces what he knows to be an indefinite future of the same conditions or worse. He asked his friend to shoot him in the hand. The friend initially refuses, horrified, but Private K persists, explaining that if his friend does not help him, he will do it himself, and a self-inflicted wound is more detectable than one inflicted by another person. Eventually, the friend agrees. The shot is fired. Private K is evacuated. His friend reports the injury as occurring during a firefight with Soviet forces. For a time, the story holds. What happens next varies by case. In some instances, the story is never seriously questioned and both men escape detection. In others, inconsistencies emerge. Perhaps a Soviet attack at the specified time and location cannot be confirmed, or a witness reports something that contradicts the official account, or the medical examination of the wound reveals anomalies. When the case comes before a Feldgericht, both men face prosecution. Private K for Selbstverstümmelung and his friend for abetting it, as well as potentially for making a false report to military authorities. Both face the possibility of the death sentence. Whether they are actually executed depends on a combination of the strength of the evidence, the temperament of the presiding judge, the phase of the war, and factors as arbitrary as the political climate in that particular military district at that particular moment. In the earlier years of the war, when the Wehrmacht still had enormous manpower reserves, courts were somewhat more willing to impose prison sentences that would eventually return the men to duty rather than execute them outright. In the desperate final years when every available man was needed and the military's tolerance for any form of defection had evaporated entirely, death sentences became much more routine. Another category of well-documented cases involves soldiers who sustained self-inflicted wounds, not out of a desire to escape permanently, but out of a wish for temporary relief. A few weeks in a hospital, a brief interruption in the grinding monotony of frontline life. These men often had no intention of permanently disabling themselves and chose methods of self-injury specifically calibrated to produce serious but not crippling wounds. A minor gunshot through the fleshy part of the left hand, carefully aimed to miss the major tendons and bones, might produce a wound serious enough to require evacuation, but not serious enough to cause permanent functional impairment. Such wounds could heal within weeks, returning the soldier to duty, but having afforded him a desperately needed respite. This category of soldier was, from the military's perspective, in some ways more troubling than the man who wanted to permanently escape. He was calculating the system, treating his own body as a tool to be manipulated within the machinery of military medicine. And paradoxically, because these wounds were designed to be minor and to heal quickly, they were in some respects easier to disguise. A small, clean wound through soft tissue might present no obvious powder burn evidence and might plausibly have occurred from a fragment of Soviet artillery fire or a ricochet in combat. The problem of malingering, the simulation of illness or injury, without any actual physical damage, ran parallel to the problem of self-inflicted wounds, but was treated somewhat differently by the military legal system. A soldier who successfully faked illness, convincing military doctors that he was suffering from a condition he did not actually have, was engaged in a form of military fraud that was punishable under the military penal code, but was generally treated less harshly than outright Selbstverstümmelung. This created an incentive for soldiers to attempt simulation of illness as a less legally risky alternative to actual self-injury. The methods used for successful simulation were various and sometimes remarkably sophisticated. Elevated heart rate could be temporarily induced by drinking strong coffee or by a variety of other substances. Certain medicines or household chemicals could produce symptoms that mimicked specific illnesses. Skin conditions could sometimes be induced or exacerbated by deliberate application of irritants. Psychiatric symptoms, tremors, speech problems, apparent amnesia, dissociative states were sometimes genuinely produced by men under extreme psychological stress who had not deliberately set out to simulate but found themselves unable to function, and then found that their genuine dysfunction could, with some management, be presented to military doctors as serious enough to warrant evacuation. The German military's medical surveillance system was in a constant arms race with soldiers seeking to exploit it. As new methods of simulation or self-injury became known, medical protocols were updated to detect them. As detection protocols improved, more sophisticated methods were developed. This dynamic created a body of practical knowledge on both sides, in the military medical community and among frontline soldiers, that accumulated over the course of the war and eventually constituted a significant institutional knowledge base on both the commission and detection of self-inflicted military injuries. The role of the Wehrmacht's Feldgendarmerie, the military police, in enforcing military law with respect to Selbstverstümmelung deserves specific attention. The Feldgendarmerie, recognizable by the distinctive gorget plates they wore around their necks, which earned them the nickname Kettenhunde or chain dogs among ordinary soldiers, had broad powers of arrest, investigation, and summary justice under wartime emergency provisions. In the later years of the war, as the military situation deteriorated and the High Command became increasingly desperate to prevent any form of defection, the Feldgendarmerie increasingly operated as a force for violent internal discipline rather than simple police work. Flying courts-martial were established that could try, convict and execute soldiers in the field with minimal procedural safeguards. Men accused of self-inflicted wounds, desertion or Wehrkraftzersetzung could be tried, convicted and shot within hours of arrest, with their bodies sometimes left hanging or displayed as warnings to others. The expansion of this kind of summary military terror in 1944 and 1945 represented the complete triumph of the Nazi system's logic over any remaining pretense of legal process. One figure who embodied this ruthless approach to military discipline was General Ferdinand Schörner, who held various army group commands in the later years of the war and became notorious for his willingness to execute soldiers for real or alleged cowardice, self-injury, or unauthorized withdrawal. Schörner, a genuine ideological Nazi unlike many of his fellow generals who maintained a certain professional distance from Nazi ideology, believed that terror was the essential tool of military leadership when all other motivations had failed. He issued orders explicitly stating that soldiers who tried to escape duty through self-inflicted wounds were to be shot immediately upon detection, without the formality of a trial. Whether these orders were actually carried out is difficult to confirm in every case, but the threat was real, and the atmosphere of fear and violence in units under his command was documented by multiple witnesses. Soldiers serving under Schörner's command in Army Group Center and later Army Group South in 1944 and 1945 described an environment in which the fear of their own commanders sometimes rivaled the fear of the enemy. Exactly the situation that the High Command intended to create, believing that placing men between two fears would force them toward the front. The North African Theatre of Operations, where German forces under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel fought against the British, and later American forces between 1941 and 1943, presented a different context for self-inflicted wounds, one that reveals how much the specific environmental and psychological conditions of each theatre shaped the phenomenon. In North Africa, the conditions were physically harsh but in different ways from the Eastern Front: extreme heat rather than extreme cold, limited water rather than limited warmth, and a front that, while dangerous, was characterized by more mobile and variable fighting than the grinding attrition of the Eastern Front. The Deutsches Afrikakorps was a relatively small elite force that benefited from strong unit cohesion, the personal charisma and reputation of Rommel, and the at least occasional experience of tactical success, something that became increasingly rare on the Eastern Front. Self-inflicted wound cases did occur in North Africa, but they appear to have been significantly less common than on the Eastern Front, at least until the final months when the Afrika Korps was clearly being defeated and the prospect of capture by British or American forces was being weighed against continued resistance. The relatively better physical conditions, the higher morale associated with a theatre that at least initially seemed like it might offer the possibility of victory, and the different psychological dynamic of a smaller, more cohesive force all contributed to a lower rate of the most desperate survival behaviours. When German forces invaded Italy following the Allied landings in Sicily in July 1943 and the subsequent invasion of mainland Italy in September of that year, a new theatre of operations opened up with its own distinct conditions and its own character of human breakdown. The Italian campaign is sometimes described by military historians as one of the most grueling and thankless of the entire war. A grinding advance by Allied forces up a peninsula perfectly suited to defensive warfare, with the Germans using every ridge, river and hilltop to establish successive defensive lines that had to be broken at enormous cost. For German soldiers defending these positions, the Italian campaign combined the static, attrition warfare aspects of the Eastern Front with the added psychological dimension of fighting a defensive war in a country they had ostensibly been protecting as an ally, now turned into a theatre of punishment. The conditions in Italy were in some respects different from those on the Eastern Front. There was no equivalent of the Russian winter, though the Apennine Mountains in winter were cold and wet enough to produce misery of their own. But the psychological mechanisms driving self-inflicted wounds operated in similar ways. German soldiers defending the Gustav Line, the Winter Line, and other fortified positions in central Italy in the winter of 1943 to 1944, found themselves in static defensive positions under constant Allied artillery fire, with no prospect of relief or rotation and the growing awareness that the war as a whole was being lost. Italian partisans added another dimension of stress, creating a sense of potential danger even in rear areas that were supposed to be relatively safe. The combination of Allied pressure from the front and partisan activity in the rear contributed to a siege mentality that, for some soldiers, became psychologically overwhelming. Surviving records from the Felgericht system operating in Italy show a significant number of self-inflicted wound cases during the campaign, particularly concentrated in the periods of most intense static defensive fighting. The Italian theatre also produced an interesting variation on the phenomenon: the increased proximity to the Allied lines and the fact that Allied treatment of German prisoners was known to be generally humane. A stark contrast to the conditions of Soviet captivity made surrender an option that soldiers evaluated somewhat differently than on the Eastern Front. On the Eastern Front, the terror of Soviet captivity, which German soldiers had been warned about extensively, and which was, for much of the war, genuinely terrible in ways that included mass murder of prisoners, made surrender seem almost as dangerous as continued fighting. In Italy, and later in France, the perception that British and American captivity would mean reasonable treatment created a different calculus. Some soldiers who in Russia might have turned to self-injury as a means of escaping combat chose instead to surrender when circumstances permitted. A choice that, while technically desertion from the German perspective, avoided the physical pain and legal jeopardy of self-wounding. The lower rate of self-inflicted wound prosecutions in the Western theatres compared to the Eastern Front may partly reflect this alternative escape route being more practically available. The Allied invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, opening the long-anticipated Western Front in France, created yet another theatre where German soldiers faced the psychological pressures that could lead to self-injury. The men defending Normandy in the weeks following the landing were facing overwhelming Allied air superiority that made movement in daylight almost impossible. Massive Allied material superiority that ground down German defensive positions over time, and the growing strategic awareness that the war was now being lost on multiple fronts simultaneously. Unlike on the Eastern Front, where the vast distances and the desperate nature of the fighting against the Soviets maintained a certain grim momentum of mutual destruction, the Western Front in France in the summer and autumn of 1944 offered German soldiers a clearer and more immediate sense of impending military collapse. The rapid Allied advance following the breakout from Normandy in August 1944, during which German armies were shattered and forced into a chaotic retreat through France and Belgium, left many German units dissolved and their surviving members either captured, killed, or dispersed. Self-inflicted wounds as a premeditated escape strategy require a certain stability of military situation. One needs to be in a position where there is a functional medical evacuation system to exploit, and the chaos of the French retreat disrupted such calculations. Many soldiers in the dissolved units simply disappeared into the French countryside, surrendering to civilians or Allied forces, or attempting to make their way home. The V-1 and V-2 rocket program and other home front and rear area assignments created an interesting subset of cases, involving soldiers who inflicted wounds on themselves, not to escape from the front, but to avoid being transferred to the front in the first place. As casualties mounted and replacement manpower became increasingly scarce in 1944 and 1945, the Wehrmacht began converting technical, administrative and support personnel into front-line infantry soldiers, a process that produced enormous anxiety among men who had spent the war in relatively safe rear area positions and now faced the prospect of being thrown into the collapsing front lines. Cases of self-inflicted wounds among these men, soldiers who had previously had no combat experience and who knew enough about frontline conditions to be terrified of them, were noted in Wehrmacht reports from 1944 and 1945, representing a somewhat different psychological profile from the combat veteran who had reached his breaking point after months of fighting. These were men who were afraid of what they had not yet experienced, rather than men who had already experienced more than they could bear. Their choices illuminate a different aspect of the human response to the prospect of certain death, the preemptive flight from anticipated suffering rather than the escape from current suffering. The Waffen-SS, Heinrich Himmler's military arm of the SS organization, which by the later years of the war had expanded into a force of nearly 1 million men, organized into numerous divisions fighting alongside the regular Wehrmacht, presented yet another dimension of the self-inflicted wound phenomenon. The Waffen-SS had a reputation for fanatical fighting spirit and ideological commitment that was actively cultivated by its leadership and by Nazi propaganda. SS soldiers were supposed to be the ideological elite, men who had internalized National Socialist values so completely that they would fight on regardless of personal cost. The reality, inevitably, was more complicated. Waffen-SS units contained a wide range of men, genuine ideological fanatics in some cases, but also conscripts and volunteers whose commitment to National Socialism was more superficial, and by 1943 and 1944, increasingly large numbers of men who had been effectively press-ganged into SS service from occupied territories in Eastern Europe, many of whom had no meaningful attachment to Nazism at all. SS military courts, the SS Gerichte, were, if anything, even harsher than the regular Wehrmacht Feldgericht in their treatment of self-inflicted wound cases. The ideological requirement for absolute fighting spirit within the SS meant that any deviation from the expected standard of heroic sacrifice was treated with particular severity. SS soldiers convicted of Selbstverstümmelung faced death sentences as the default outcome rather than as an exceptional one, and the executions were often carried out with deliberate public visibility, witnessed by assembled unit members. This created an environment of extreme fear on both sides, fear of the enemy and the fighting conditions on one side, and fear of one's own leadership on the other. Whether this brutal internal discipline was more effective at preventing self-injury than the somewhat less extreme Wehrmacht approach is difficult to say with certainty. The available evidence suggests that self-inflicted wounds did occur in Waffen-SS units, though possibly somewhat less frequently than in comparable Wehrmacht units, a difference that might reflect the genuine ideological commitment of some SS soldiers, the more effective deterrent effect of the harsher SS justice system, or simply a difference in the age profile and physical fitness of SS troops, who were on average somewhat younger and more physically robust than regular army soldiers. One particularly striking case documented from a Waffen-SS division operating on the Eastern Front in 1943 involves a non-commissioned officer, identified in the records only by his initials, who was convicted of Selbstverstümmelung after being detected with a self-inflicted wound to his right foot, unusually to his right foot rather than the more common left, suggesting either that he was left-footed or that he had made a miscalculation. The wound showed clear evidence of close-range discharge, including heavy powder residue. What makes this case particularly notable is the extensive documentation of the accused's psychological state that emerged during the investigation and trial. Letters found among his possessions described in detail his mounting despair, his belief that Germany would lose the war, and his conviction that continuing to fight was pointless. He wrote of watching young replacements, some of them barely 18 years old, arrive at the front only to be killed within days, and of his inability to see any purpose in this ongoing sacrifice. His defense attorney, a military lawyer assigned to the case, made an unprecedented attempt to argue that his psychological state constituted a mitigating factor, citing the obvious evidence of combat exhaustion and what we would today recognize as severe depression. The court rejected this argument and sentenced the NCO to death. He was executed by firing squad in March 1943. This case is instructive not just because of the individual tragedy it represents, but because of what it reveals about the conceptual framework within which German military justice operated. The defense attorney's argument that extreme psychological suffering constituted a form of diminished responsibility was a fundamentally modern, medically informed approach to legal responsibility that was essentially incompatible with the Nazi military justice system's ideological premises. To accept such an argument would have been to acknowledge that the conditions of the Eastern Front could legitimately overwhelm the human capacity for sustained commitment, which in turn would have undermined the entire basis on which men were being demanded to sacrifice themselves. The court's rejection was therefore not simply a legal decision but an ideological one. It refused to recognize the legitimacy of the reality it was confronting. As 1944 progressed and the Soviet Red Army launched its massive summer offensive, Operation Bagration, which devastated Army Group Center and destroyed hundreds of thousands of German soldiers in a catastrophe comparable in scale to Stalingrad, the psychological state of German forces on the Eastern Front deteriorated sharply. The evidence suggests a corresponding sharp increase in self-inflicted wound cases during this period. Operation Bagration, launched on June 23, 1944, exactly 3 years after the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, destroyed 28 German divisions in less than 2 months, killing or capturing over 500,000 German soldiers. The survivors of these destroyed units, scattered across the Lithuanian and Belarusian forests and fields, often had no organized military framework to return to and faced the choice of fighting on as partisans, surrendering to the Soviets, or attempting to flee westward toward the German lines, which were themselves in chaotic retreat. In this environment, organized Selbstverstümmelung of the sort that relied on a functional medical evacuation system was largely impossible, replaced by more improvised and desperate forms of self-harm and by mass desertion. What is particularly notable about the period of Operation Bagration and its aftermath is the survival of a handful of extraordinary soldier testimonies, diaries and letters that somehow survive the chaos, that provide the most direct expressions of the internal experience of men who were contemplating or had carried out self-inflicted wounds. One account from a German soldier identified in post-war research as a 23-year-old from Munich who survived the war and gave testimony to a German historian in the 1960s describes with remarkable clarity the moment at which he decided to wound himself. He recalled sitting in a collapsed building on the outskirts of Minsk in the summer of 1944, alone, all his unit companions either dead or scattered, listening to Soviet artillery in the distance. He wrote that he had a sudden vivid thought of his mother in Munich, of the kitchen where they had eaten breakfast together before he left for basic training, of the smell of coffee and bread. And then, he thought, I will never see that kitchen again. Not because I will die in Russia, but because if I continue as I am, I will lose the capacity to feel anything, and the person who might go back to that kitchen will no longer be the person I was. That thought, he explained, was when he decided. He was not, he said, afraid of dying. He was afraid of what continued fighting was doing to him, to who he was as a human being. He shot himself through the left hand that afternoon and was evacuated 2 days later. This testimony points to something important that historians of the Second World War have increasingly recognized in recent decades. The phenomenon of Selbstverstümmelung was not only about physical survival. For some soldiers, perhaps many, it was about psychological survival. The preservation of some core sense of self that the conditions of the Eastern Front were systematically destroying. The man from Munich was not primarily calculating that a hospital bed was more comfortable than a trench, though it was. He was making a statement about the limits of what he was willing to become. This dimension of the phenomenon complicates any simple categorization of self-inflicted wounds as either heroic or cowardly, legitimate protest or criminal defection. It places them in a more ambiguous moral space, one that the Nazi military justice system was constitutionally unable to acknowledge, but that modern historical understanding is better equipped to engage with. The comparison between the German military's treatment of self-inflicted wounds and the approaches taken by Allied armies to the same phenomenon, and it did occur in all armies, though at very different rates and with very different legal and medical responses, is illuminating. The British military had its own category of prohibited behaviour under the Army Act. Self-infliction of a wound to avoid service, or Section 40 of the Army Act, was a criminal offence. But the British approach was shaped by the traumatic memory of the First World War's mass executions of soldiers for cowardice and desertion. Executions that had become deeply controversial in post-war Britain, and that Parliament and the military establishment were determined not to repeat. The result was that British military justice in the Second World War, while still capable of harshness, operated with significantly more procedural caution and significantly more willingness to recognise psychological disturbance as a legitimate medical condition rather than simply a form of moral failure. British soldiers diagnosed with what was called lack of moral fibre, or LMF, a deliberately vague and somewhat pejorative category that covered everything from genuine cowardice to combat exhaustion, were typically removed from flying or frontline duties and reassigned rather than court-martialed and executed. The stigma was real and lasting, but the physical consequences were far less severe than those imposed by German military justice. The American military went further still in recognizing the psychological dimension of combat breakdown. The concept of combat fatigue, later refined into a more precise understanding of acute stress reaction, was developed and progressively refined by American military psychiatrists during the Second World War, drawing on the work of researchers like Roy Grinker and John Spiegel, whose landmark 1945 study, Men Under Stress, drew on extensive clinical experience with American soldiers in North Africa and Italy. American military doctrine increasingly recognized that combat exposure had measurable limits, and that rotating men out of frontline duty before they reached those limits was not just humane but strategically necessary, that an army of psychologically intact soldiers was more effective than one that had been ground down to nothing. American soldiers who showed signs of severe psychological disturbance were treated as medical cases, removed from combat, and given psychiatric care. Cases of self-inflicted wounds did occur among American soldiers. The American military tried thousands of such cases during the war, but the rate appears to have been significantly lower than in the German military, a difference that military historians attribute in part to the more humane rotation and leave systems, the genuine psychiatric support available, and the overall better physical conditions under which American soldiers served, all of which prevented the extreme desperation that drove German soldiers to such measures. The Soviet Red Army's approach to self-inflicted wounds, by contrast, was in some ways even harsher than the German, though for different ideological reasons. The Soviet military penal system, including the infamous Strafbat, the penal battalions where convicted soldiers were sent to perform the most dangerous tasks in the hope of redeeming themselves through fighting, treated self-inflicted wounds with extreme severity, sometimes executing soldiers on the spot without any formal proceedings. The political commissars embedded in every Soviet unit had the authority to shoot soldiers for cowardice or defection without trial, and this authority was exercised. Interestingly, while the severe punishments in the Soviet system did not eliminate self-inflicted wounds, they occurred throughout the Red Army's experience of the war. The combination of ideological commitment, genuine national defense motivations, Soviet soldiers were defending their actual homeland, not engaging in a war of conquest, and extremely harsh consequences may have kept the rate lower than it would otherwise have been. The comparison between Soviet and German armies on this point is complex, however, because Soviet record-keeping was in many respects less systematic than German, and the true rate of self-inflicted wounds in the Red Army may be impossible to determine with confidence. One aspect of the phenomenon that has received relatively little attention from historians is the experience of soldiers from occupied and Allied countries who served in German military formations. By the middle years of the war, the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS had incorporated substantial numbers of men from occupied Western European countries, from Allied Hungary and Romania, from the Baltic states, Ukraine and other parts of the Soviet Union, and from other territories under German control. These men's motivations for serving ranged from genuine ideological sympathy with Nazism to desperate attempts to avoid worse alternatives, and their psychological relationship to the war was correspondingly varied. Men who had been effectively coerced into German service, or who had been promised conditions that proved radically different from what was delivered, were in some ways even more likely to resort to self-injury than German soldiers themselves, since they had fewer ideological investments in the outcome of the war. Cases involving soldiers from Eastern European auxiliary formations, known as Heeres or Hilfswillige when they were Soviet citizens serving the Germans, present some of the most extreme stories of desperation in the entire Selbstverstümmelung record. Men who had originally surrendered to the Germans partly to escape the appalling conditions of Soviet POW camps, and who then found themselves pressed into German military service on the Eastern Front, occupied an extraordinarily precarious position, unwilling to fight for Germany, unable to surrender to the Soviets who viewed them as traitors, and subject to German military justice if they tried to escape. For some of these men, self-inflicted wounds represented one of the very few options available in an almost entirely closed situation. The physical methods used for self-injury also evolved over the course of the war as detection techniques improved, and soldiers developed countermeasures. Beyond the basic approaches of gunshot wounds to the hand or foot, and deliberate frostbite exposure already discussed, a range of other methods appear in the historical record. Chemical burns, produced by applying caustic substances like concentrated acids or alkalis to the skin, were occasionally used. These had the advantage of not producing the telltale powder residue of a gunshot wound and could sometimes be attributed to accidental contact with vehicle fluids, cleaning agents, or other chemicals present in a military environment. Infections produced by deliberately contaminating wounds, either pre-existing minor injuries or self-inflicted cuts, with foreign material were also attempted. A wound that developed serious cellulitis or sepsis could be incapacitating enough to require evacuation. Some soldiers attempted to induce conditions that would show up in blood or urine tests as signs of serious illness. Elevated glucose levels mimicking diabetes, artificially elevated blood pressure, or symptoms of heart irregularity produced through ingestion of pharmaceutical substances. These more sophisticated approaches required some medical knowledge and access to suitable substances, making them more accessible to soldiers with medical training or those stationed where pharmaceutical supplies were available than to the ordinary frontline infantryman. The final year of the war, from the summer of 1944 through the German surrender on May 8, 1945, represents the period of most extreme psychological breakdown in the German military, and correspondingly, the period in which the most desperate survival behaviours, including self-inflicted wounds, reached their highest levels. Understanding what German soldiers were facing in this final year requires understanding the military situation they were in, which was essentially one of total collapse occurring at different speeds on different fronts simultaneously. In the east, the Soviet Red Army was rolling westward in a series of massive offensives that had already destroyed Army Group Center and were progressively pushing German forces back toward the pre-war German border and beyond. In the west, the Allied forces that had broken out of Normandy in August 1944 had swept across France and Belgium and were approaching the German border. In the south, Allied forces in Italy were pressing northward. Germany itself was under constant Allied air bombardment that was systematically destroying its cities, its industry, and its transportation network. And at home, the social structures that had sustained German civilian morale, the family unit, the community, the church, the normal rhythms of daily life, were being disrupted and destroyed by the same bombing campaigns and by the increasing demands of a regime that was cannibalizing its own population in a last desperate attempt to continue a war that had already been lost. For the ordinary German soldier in this environment, the question of whether to continue fighting was no longer truly a question of military effectiveness or even of patriotism in any conventional sense. It had become a question of survival, both individual and collective. The Wehrmacht's propaganda messaging in the final year of the war shifted significantly. No longer promising victory, it shifted to arguing that the consequences of a German defeat, specifically the Soviet occupation of Germany and the fate of German civilians under Soviet rule, were so catastrophic that every soldier was obligated to fight to the last regardless of the military situation. This argument had real emotional force. Many German soldiers had witnessed what German forces had done in the Soviet Union and could credibly fear Soviet retribution. But it was also, at its core, a calculation that made the individual soldier a sacrificial element in a political strategy rather than a human being with legitimate survival interests, and it was an argument whose credibility depended on soldiers not knowing or not believing that the Western Allies offered a genuine alternative to Soviet occupation, an alternative of surrender and reasonable captivity that many German soldiers on the Western Front were increasingly aware of. The formation of improvised units from rear area personnel, administrative workers, and even wounded soldiers barely recovered from previous injuries became increasingly common in 1944 and 1945, a practice that the Wehrmacht called Alarmeinheiten, alarm units created in response to emergency situations and dissolved when the immediate crisis passed. For men who had thought themselves in relatively safe rear area positions, the sudden conscription into combat units through these emergency measures was profoundly destabilizing. Many of these men had no recent combat experience, inadequate equipment, minimal training for the specific conditions they were being thrown into, and no established bonds with the other men in their improvised units. The social cohesion that military researchers have consistently identified as one of the most important factors in maintaining unit effectiveness and individual psychological resilience. The feeling of being known and valued by one's immediate comrades, of being part of a group whose shared survival depended on mutual loyalty, was absent in these improvisations. Men thrown together in emergency units had no history with each other, no established trust, and no particular reason to sacrifice themselves for strangers. In these conditions, the rate of self-protective behavior, including self-inflicted wounds, was predictably high. The Volkssturm, the People's Militia formed by Hitler's decree on September 25, 1944, and comprising men previously exempted from regular military service, men over 45, men with disqualifying medical conditions, boys of 16 and 17, represented an extreme example of this dynamic. These were individuals who had been classified as unfit for military service precisely because they lacked the physical or psychological resilience to survive frontline combat, and who were now being thrown into frontline combat anyway, equipped with minimal weapons and no meaningful training. The psychological impact on these men, many of whom had families they were directly defending as the front approached their own homes and towns, was extreme. Cases of self-inflicted wounds in Volkssturm units appear in the records of the final months of the war, though documentation from this period is particularly fragmentary. What is clear is that the Volkssturm, despite its propaganda framing as a heroic people's defense force, was in practice a catastrophically mismanaged final sacrifice of men who could not reasonably be expected to fight effectively and who had powerful reasons to want to survive. It is worth examining in some detail the case of the Festung, fortress system, that Hitler imposed on his armies in the final years of the war, since these fortified positions were among the sites of the most concentrated and documented instances of psychological breakdown and self-inflicted wounds in the entire conflict. Beginning in 1944, as German forces retreated across Eastern Europe, Hitler repeatedly declared that specific cities, towns, or strategic positions were Festungen, fortresses that were to be held at all costs, without any consideration of the tactical or strategic logic of holding them. These declarations were often militarily irrational, holding a besieged city typically tied down and ultimately destroyed the German garrison, while providing relatively little benefit to the overall defense. The men trapped in these fortresses, surrounded by Soviet forces with no prospect of relief or retreat, faced a situation of almost complete hopelessness. Breslau, Königsberg, Kolberg, Kustrin, Poznan. The list of declared Festungen in the final year of the war is long, and in every case the garrison eventually fell, either through defeat in battle or through surrender after weeks or months of increasingly desperate fighting. The psychological state of men in these besieged fortresses is documented in diaries, letters, and post-war testimonies that present some of the most extreme accounts of human endurance and breakdown in the entire war. Soldiers in Festung. Breslau, which was surrounded by Soviet forces in February 1945 and held until May 6, 1945, 2 days before the general German surrender, wrote in their diaries about a progressive narrowing of the psychological horizon, a shrinking of concern from the fate of the war and of Germany to the immediate circle of comrades, to personal survival, to the simple question of whether one would live through the next Soviet artillery barrage. Self-inflicted wounds in this environment were both more common and more complicated than in open front situations. More common because the hopelessness of the situation removed many of the deterrent calculations that might have discouraged men in more open tactical situations, but more complicated because the closed nature of a siege meant that medical evacuation was impossible. There was nowhere to evacuate to, so that self-injury could not serve the usual function of getting out. In these terminal situations, self-injury sometimes took on a different character, approaching what might be called suicidal or semi-suicidal behavior, acts of self-destruction that were less about achieving any practical escape and more about the expression of a psyche that had reached the absolute limits of what it could endure. Suicide itself became a significant factor in the final months of the war. The German military recorded thousands of suicides among its personnel in 1944 and 1945. A dramatic increase over earlier years and a phenomenon that reflected the complete psychological collapse of many soldiers when they faced the reality of total military defeat. The German officer corps in particular showed elevated suicide rates, partly reflecting the class-specific shame of defeat for men who had made military service their life's purpose and who could not imagine surviving the destruction of everything they had devoted themselves to. But suicide also occurred among enlisted men, typically in situations of particular desperation, encircled units, men about to be captured by Soviet forces, soldiers facing imminent court-martial for crimes they had committed. Some of these suicides shaded into what might be considered a final form of self-inflicted injury, the lethal version of the escape impulse that had motivated self-wounding throughout the war. The legal machinery of the Feldgericht system continued to function, and even to intensify right up to the final days of the war. The drumhead courts-martial of the Himmler-appointed SS courts and the flying courts-martial of commanders like Schörner operated with complete disregard for any legal procedure in the final weeks, executing soldiers for alleged cowardice, desertion, or Wehrkraftzersetzung on the basis of the most minimal evidence or no evidence at all. White sheets hung from windows as signals to advancing Allied forces, men found without their weapons or without their units, soldiers of any age or rank who expressed pessimism or seemed insufficiently committed to continued resistance, all faced the possibility of summary execution. In this environment of total terror, the options available to a German soldier who could no longer fight were truly terrible. Continue fighting and risk death at enemy hands. Try to surrender to the Allies and risk being caught and executed by German military police before reaching Allied lines. Desert and face the same risk. Or inflict a wound severe enough to require evacuation, while hoping that the medical system could still function well enough to get one to a hospital before the entire situation collapsed around one. The experiences of German soldiers who self-inflicted wounds in this final period and then survived to tell their stories form one of the most haunting bodies of testimony in the vast oral history archive of the Second World War. Men who wounded themselves in January or February or March 1945 in the final weeks of organised German resistance often faced outcomes completely different from what they had planned. Hospital facilities had been bombed or overrun. Medical staff had fled or been reassigned to combat duties. Supply lines that might have delivered pain medication and surgical equipment no longer functioned. Some men who had expected to find themselves in a military hospital instead found themselves lying in makeshift facilities in basements or churches, tended by volunteer civilian nurses with no medical supplies as the war rolled over and past them. Others were swept up in the chaos of the final German retreat and found themselves at Allied prisoner of war collection points, their wounds being treated by American or British military doctors who asked no questions about how the injuries had occurred. For these survivors, the aftermath of their self-inflicted wounds was complicated by the complete collapse of the German military legal system that had threatened them with execution. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, the Feldgericht system ceased to exist. The men who had lived in terror of its courts found themselves suddenly free of that threat, though they often faced an entirely new set of challenges. Allied POW camps, denazification proceedings, the destruction of their homes and communities, and the profound psychological aftermath of what they had experienced and done. Some of these men spoke openly about their self-inflicted wounds after the war, in the context of historical research or personal memoirs. Others carried the secret for the rest of their lives, never telling even their closest family members. The social stigma attached to Selbstverstümmelung in German post-war culture was complex. On one hand, the Nazi framing of such acts as cowardice and treason had been thoroughly discredited, along with everything else the Nazi regime stood for. On the other hand, the culture of military honor and the glorification of the fighting soldier, which persisted in West Germany through veterans' organizations and public commemorations well into the 1980s, made any admission of having fled the front through self-injury a source of potential shame even decades after the fact. The scholarly study of the phenomenon of Selbstverstümmelung in the German military became possible only gradually, as archives were opened, and the direct experience of the veterans became accessible to researchers asking questions that would have been inconceivable in the immediate post-war decades. The work of historians like Manfred Messerschmitt on Wehrmacht military justice, of Christian Streit on the treatment of Soviet prisoners of war, of Omer Bartov on the ideology of the German fighting soldier, and of Sönke Neitzel and Harold Welzer on the recorded private conversations of German POWs, all contributed to building a more complete picture of the psychological world of the German soldier at war. These scholars, drawing on court records, medical archives, letters, diaries, and the transcripts of secretly recorded POW conversations, made it possible to see self-inflicted wounds not as isolated criminal incidents, but as a systemic response to systemic conditions, the predictable outcome of placing millions of human beings in conditions of extreme duress with no legitimate exit. The recorded conversations of German POWs, secretly transcribed by British intelligence at Trent Park and other facilities, and later published by Neitzel and Welser, are particularly illuminating because they capture German soldiers speaking candidly among themselves, without the self-censorship that governed their formal testimony. In these conversations, references to self-inflicted wounds appear occasionally, typically discussed with a matter-of-fact pragmatism, rather than the moral condemnation that official German sources required. Men speak of comrades who got themselves out using the German phrase sich durchgewurstelt, literally wriggled through, with a tone that suggests understanding and even admiration for the practical resourcefulness of those who found ways to escape impossible situations. One conversation, transcribed in November 1944, includes a general officer making the oblique observation that a man who chose to wound himself, rather than continue a fight he could see was hopeless, was, in a certain sense, demonstrating more rational judgment than those who continued fighting. This remark was not intended as an endorsement of Selbstverstümmelung, the general who made it was himself a committed professional soldier, but it reflected the profound ambivalence about military obligation that was penetrating even the officer corps by the final year of the war. What can the historical analysis of self-inflicted wounds in the German military tell us about the broader human experience of war? Several conclusions emerge from the evidence. The first is that no ideological system, however total and however reinforced by terror, can indefinitely override the basic human drive for survival. The Nazi systems claimed to own the lives and bodies of German soldiers completely, to direct those bodies into battle regardless of the outcome and to execute those who refused, confronted the irreducible biological and psychological reality that human beings resist destruction with every tool available to them. The very extremity of the German military's punishments for self-inflicted wounds, escalating from imprisonment to the death sentence, was a form of acknowledgement, however unintentional, that the drive to survive was powerful enough to require massive coercion to override. The system was fighting not just against individual soldiers, but against human nature itself. The second conclusion concerns the relationship between psychological support and military effectiveness. The German military's contemptuous dismissal of psychological distress as weakness or cowardice, and its consequent failure to provide any meaningful system of support or rotation for soldiers at the breaking point, was not just morally wrong, it was strategically counterproductive. The evidence from Allied armies that provided genuine psychological support and regular rotation suggests that these measures didn't make soldiers less willing to fight. On the contrary, by preserving psychological resilience over time, they produced soldiers capable of sustained effective combat over much longer periods than their German counterparts. The Wehrmacht's harshness corroded its own effectiveness over time, producing an army in 1944 and 1945 that was increasingly fragile precisely because it had been denied the maintenance that human beings require. A tank runs out of fuel and can be refueled. A soldier runs out of the psychological capacity for further endurance, and if not given the chance to recover, cannot be refueled. He can only be threatened, and threats, as the history of Selbstverstümmelung demonstrates, have definite limits as motivators. The third conclusion is about the moral complexity inherent in the act of self-injury under combat conditions. The German military and the Nazi regime characterized Selbstverstümmelung as a simple moral failing: cowardice, selfishness, betrayal. Modern understanding, informed by decades of psychological research on combat trauma, PTSD, and the human stress response, recognizes it as something far more complex, an act committed at the intersection of genuine physiological limits, impossible social demands, and the fundamental human will to continue existing. The man who shot himself in the hand after watching his entire unit be destroyed was not making a calculation of personal comfort versus duty. He was responding to conditions that had pushed him past the boundary of what any human being can endure. To condemn him without acknowledging the system that created those conditions is to participate in the same moral logic that created the system in the first place. The fourth conclusion concerns legacy and memory. The German soldiers who survived the Second World War, including those who had resorted to self-inflicted wounds, returned to a society that spent the first 2 post-war decades largely avoiding discussion of the war's most difficult moral dimensions. The collective amnesia that German historians later called the Schlussstrich-Mentalität, the mentality of drawing a line under the past, extended to the experiences of individual soldiers who had broken under the strain of impossible demands. Veterans organizations which were influential in West German society through the 1950s and 1960s celebrated the military service of the war generation while carefully avoiding any examination of how individual soldiers had actually experienced and responded to the conditions they faced. The men who had wounded themselves to escape those conditions had every incentive to maintain silence about their experiences, and most did. Only in the later decades of the 20th century, as the direct veteran generation aged and as historical research created a less judgmental framework for understanding individual experiences within the context of systemic conditions, did these stories begin to emerge. The continuing relevance of this history extends well beyond the specific context of the Second World War. Every armed conflict produces similar phenomena. Soldiers who reach breaking points and respond with behaviors that their military systems classify as crimes, but that modern psychology would recognize as stress responses. The American military in Vietnam faced significant problems with self-inflicted wounds, fragging of officers, drug abuse, and other behaviors that reflected the psychological impact of a war whose purpose was unclear to those fighting it. Modern armies, drawing on the lessons of World War II and subsequent conflicts, have increasingly moved toward acknowledging the reality of combat stress and providing systemic support for soldiers who reach their limits, rather than relying purely on punishment and shame as deterrents. The development of post-traumatic stress disorder as a recognized medical diagnosis, the creation of combat stress control units, the implementation of rotation policies and mandatory rest periods, the provision of mental health services to active duty personnel, all of these reflect an understanding of the human limits of military endurance that the Nazi military system categorically rejected. There is also the question of what the phenomenon tells us about the essential nature of the Wehrmacht itself. The German military's willingness to execute 15,000 of its own soldiers, a number that dwarfs the comparable figures for any other major belligerent in the conflict, reflected not just ideological fanaticism, but a fundamental conceptual failure. The belief that human beings could be made to function as pure instruments of state power, that the individual soldier's survival instinct, psychological health, and fundamental humanity could be simply overridden by sufficiently extreme demands and sufficiently severe punishments. The history of Selbstverstümmelung demonstrates the failure of this belief with brutal clarity. Men found ways to resist, however desperately and at whatever cost to themselves, the absolute claim that the Nazi system made on their bodies and lives. They did so not heroically, not in organized resistance, but in the most private and painful ways imaginable. And in doing so, they affirmed something that the system they served was trying to deny, that every soldier, however he was trained and however he was threatened, remained in the end a human being with limits, with fears, with a life he wanted to live, and a self he wanted to preserve. The numbers of men who resorted to self-inflicted wounds over the course of the war, certainly in the tens of thousands, possibly more, represented only a small fraction of the total German military force, which numbered around 18 million men over the course of the conflict. But they are significant, not as a statistical phenomenon, but as a human one. Each case represents an individual's confrontation with an impossible situation, a moment of decision that was at once terribly rational and terribly desperate, a choice made under conditions that no system of military justice, however harsh, could entirely prevent or explain away. Their stories deserve to be part of our understanding of the Second World War, not as footnotes to the grand strategic narrative, but as evidence of the essential humanity that persisted even in the most dehumanizing conditions ever imposed by one group of human beings on another. The role of religion and moral conscience in the decision to self-inflict wounds represents another dimension that historians have only recently begun to examine systematically. The German military of the Second World War contained men of widely varying religious backgrounds and degrees of religious commitment. Practicing Catholics and Protestants, nominal Christians who retained cultural but not active religious identity, committed atheists who had embraced National Socialist ideology's rejection of Christianity, and a spectrum of positions in between. How did religious conviction interact with the extreme situations that drove soldiers towards self-injury? The evidence is fragmentary and somewhat contradictory, reflecting the enormous individual variation in how people integrate religious belief with the demands of extreme circumstances. For some soldiers, religious faith appears to have served as a sustaining force that helped them endure conditions that might otherwise have led to breakdown. The belief that suffering had meaning, that God was present even in the most extreme situations, that death was not the ultimate end. These convictions provided frameworks for interpreting and coping with experiences that had no adequate secular explanation. Soldiers with strong religious commitments sometimes wrote in letters home about finding consolation in prayer, in the religious services conducted by military chaplains, or simply in the private practice of faith maintained even in the conditions of the Eastern Front. For these men, faith may have been a genuine psychological resource that reduced the probability of reaching the breaking point at which self-injury seemed necessary. But for other soldiers, religious conscience appears to have created a specific kind of moral crisis around the question of self-injury that those without strong religious commitments did not face in the same form. The tradition of Christian teaching on the sanctity of the body and the wrongfulness of deliberately harming oneself, a tradition that extended from theological arguments against suicide to more general principles about the integrity of the divinely created body, place soldiers of genuine faith in a particular dilemma when considering self-wounding. To wound oneself deliberately was, from a traditional Christian perspective, a form of sin against one's own body. The moral weight of this consideration, added to the legal and social risks already attending Selbstverstümmelung, may have acted as an additional deterrent for some deeply religious soldiers, preventing them from taking steps they might otherwise have taken. Conversely, some soldiers experienced profound religious guilt in the aftermath of self-inflicted wounds they had already committed, guilt that became an additional psychological burden on top of the physical pain and legal jeopardy of the situation. The military chaplains of the Wehrmacht, Catholic priests and Protestant pastors serving in uniformed military capacity with officer rank, occupied a uniquely sensitive position in relation to this phenomenon. Bound by professional and religious obligations to maintain the confidences of the men who confided in them, military chaplains sometimes became the recipients of extraordinarily difficult confessions and admissions. Men who had committed or were planning self-injury, men who had helped comrades wound themselves, men racked with guilt about actions they had taken in the general course of the war, all of these could potentially approach a military chaplain in search of pastoral care. What the chaplains did with these confidences varied enormously. Some fulfilled their pastoral role with genuine compassion and discretion, providing what care they could without exposing the men who had trusted them. Others, caught between their pastoral obligations and their military ones, made choices that were sometimes helpful and sometimes harmful to the men involved. The records of military chaplaincy in the German military during the Second World War are not comprehensive, but enough has survived in church archives and in post-war testimony to suggest that some chaplains played important roles, sometimes protective, sometimes not, in the lives of soldiers navigating the extreme moral terrain of the Eastern Front. The geography of psychological breakdown also followed certain patterns within the army's social structure that merit attention. The German military's rigid hierarchy, which ran from Gefreiter to Generalfeldmarschall through numerous intermediate ranks, created very different experiences at different levels of the structure. The ordinary infantryman, the Lancer, as German soldiers called themselves, bore the greatest physical burden of frontline combat with the least power to influence his own situation. He could not arrange staff postings, could not order himself to the rear for professional development, could not exploit personal connections with senior officers to obtain better assignments. His options in the face of unbearable conditions were genuinely limited to the desperate ones: endure, desert, or wound himself. Non-commissioned officers, the Unteroffiziere and Feldwebel, who formed the backbone of German unit cohesion, had somewhat more ability to manage their own situations, were somewhat more likely to have personal relationships with officers who might quietly arrange accommodation of their needs, and faced the additional burden of being responsible for the men under their command, in ways that created both a source of purpose and a source of additional stress. Commissioned officers had significantly more ability to manage their own situations, both formally through the mechanisms of legitimate transfer and posting, and informally through the networks of social connection that linked the officer corps together. This created a social stratification of self-inflicted wound cases that reflected the general social stratification of the army. Most documented cases involved the lower enlisted ranks. Cases involving NCOs were less common. Cases involving officers were rarer still, though they did occur and were treated with a curious mixture of official harshness, the same death sentences in principle, and practical leniency that reflected the army's reluctance to execute the officer corps on whom its continued functioning depended. The class dynamics of Wehrmacht military justice, like the class dynamics of military justice in virtually every army in history, produced different outcomes for men of different social backgrounds and ranks when they faced the same formal charges. The phenomenon of Selbstverstümmelung also intersected, in ways that historians have only recently begun to fully explore, with the broader question of German soldiers' moral responses to the crimes that were committed in their presence or with their participation. The war on the Eastern Front was, from its very beginning, a war of deliberate mass murder as well as of military contest. German soldiers who participated in or witnessed the Einsatzgruppen killings, the starvation of Soviet prisoners, the systematic burning of villages, the hanging of partisans, soldiers who became, in short, participants or witnesses to genocide, were not psychologically unaffected by these experiences. The relationship between this kind of moral corruption, this erosion of the capacity for empathy and normal human response that participation in systematic atrocity tends to produce, and the development of psychological states that led some men towards self-injury is complex and not well understood. Some historians have suggested that men who retained stronger moral consciences, who had not managed to shut down their capacity for empathy as fully as others, were more likely to suffer severe psychological disturbance from their wartime experiences, and therefore more likely to reach breaking points that led to self-injury. Others have argued that the moral numbing that characterized many Eastern Front veterans was itself a form of psychological damage that expressed itself in different ways but was no less severe. What seems clear is that the violence German soldiers inflicted on others and the violence they eventually inflicted on themselves were not entirely unconnected. Both were products of the extreme conditions of a war of racial annihilation that dehumanized everyone it touched, including those who carried it out. The post-war attempts of survivors, both those who had wounded themselves and those who had not, to integrate their wartime experiences into their post-war lives, produced a wide range of outcomes. Some men emerged from the war apparently intact, able to rebuild civilian lives, form families, and participate in the reconstruction of German society without any visible psychological disruption. Whether these men were truly unaffected by what they had experienced, or whether they had simply achieved a very effective suppression of memories and emotions that might in other circumstances have emerged as symptoms, is impossible to determine with certainty. Others, a number that historians and mental health professionals now believe was far larger than was acknowledged at the time, carried the invisible wounds of the war in the form of persistent anxiety, depression, alcohol dependence, emotional withdrawal, difficulty with intimate relationships, and the specific cluster of symptoms that we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. The scale of post-war psychological suffering among German veterans, systematically invisible because the culture offered no framework for acknowledging it, represents a kind of final casualty list of the war that has never been properly counted. The question that remains, and that any thoughtful engagement with this history must grapple with, is one of judgment. How should we understand the men who wounded themselves? The Nazi system answered the question simply. They were criminals and cowards, and many of them were executed. Modern humanitarian understanding is more generous but also more complex. These men were not saints or heroes. Some of them, before reaching their breaking points, had participated in actions that we would rightly condemn, had fought in the campaigns of conquest and ideology, had witnessed atrocities and not stopped them, had been part of the machinery of the Wehrmacht in ways that implicated them in its crimes. The act of self-injury did not redeem them of this complicity, just as it did not prove the simple cowardice that the regime attributed to them. What it proved, if it proved anything beyond itself, was that they were human, capable of tremendous endurance, capable of cruelty and complicity, and eventually capable of reaching a point from which the only imaginable path was the one that led away from the war by any means available. In the post-war decades, Germany as a society underwent the slow and painful process of confronting what its military and its citizens had done during the Nazi era. The crimes of the Wehrmacht, for long obscured by the myth of a clean professional army that simply followed orders while leaving atrocities to the SS, were progressively exposed by historical research, most dramatically by the Vernichtungskrieg exhibition that travelled Germany in the late 1990s and provoked intense public debate about the complicity of ordinary soldiers in the crimes of the regime. Within this larger reckoning, the experiences of soldiers who had broken, who had wounded themselves, who had deserted or surrendered or found other ways to refuse the death that the regime demanded of them, gradually began to receive more nuanced treatment. A law passed by the German Bundestag in 2002 officially rehabilitated all soldiers convicted of desertion by Wehrmacht courts, recognizing that in many cases these convictions had been the product of an unjust legal system serving a criminal state. Similar rehabilitation, at least in the sense of historical acknowledgement, has extended to other categories of military crime, including Selbstverstümmelung, though the legal rehabilitation of self-inflicted wound convictions has been less comprehensive than that of desertion. The men who shot themselves in the hand or foot, who exposed themselves to frostbite, who arranged for comrades to wound them, who simulated illness or manufactured physical symptoms, these men lived with their choices for the rest of their lives. Some died quickly, either from wounds more serious than intended or at the hands of military courts. Others survived to old age, carrying memories that they shared with no one or only with the most trusted intimates. The historical record, fragmentary as it is, preserves enough of their voices to allow us to understand something of what they experienced and why they made the choices they did. Understanding those choices does not require approving of everything these men were or did. It requires only the recognition that when human beings are pushed to extremes, when they are trapped in situations of violence and hopelessness that their minds cannot absorb and their bodies cannot survive, they respond with the tools that remain available to them. In the German military's war on the Eastern Front and in the other theatres of the Second World War, for tens of thousands of men, the only available tool was their own bodies. And that is both a fact of history and a reflection of something enduring about the human condition. Well, that is the full story of why German soldiers injured themselves during the Second World War. It is a story that encompasses the largest military conflict in history, the most extreme conditions of human endurance, the most brutal forms of state punishment, and the most fundamental questions about what we owe to ourselves and to the systems that claim authority over our lives. We hope this video has given you a deeper understanding, not just of a specific historical phenomenon, but of the human realities that lie beneath the surface of every war. If you found this exploration informative, make sure to check out our other videos covering the experiences of German soldiers after World War II, including what happened to Germany's top field marshals and what happened to German generals after the war ended. There is always more to understand about this period of history than the most familiar headlines suggest. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more World War II content. See you in the next one.